Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the Cartoon Syndicate. Once again, I am Paul Densmore, and today we are going to look at a very cool book. This kind of forms the third leg of that trilogy of Western creators that I was talking about with the sword, the shield, and the wand. So we've already looked at the shield and the sword with Ditko and Kirby, and today we are going to look at Alex Toth. Um, and this is a book that I'm probably going to spend way too much time on personal things because this book takes me back to times and places as far as the subject matter and the book itself, me getting this book. Um, so we're going to take a look at the complete classic adventures of Zorro by Alex Toth. And as noted, when these Zorro books were actually published back in the day, back in the late 50s and early 60s, this wasn't like, oh my goodness, it's Alex Toth. Nobody knew who was doing these books, you know. It was almost kind of this, both the books and this collection were almost a mythical thing. It took me a while to track this down. I bought it several years after it was published, actually, and I don't even remember where I found it. I think part of me wants to say at a convention, but I know that that's not true. I got my black and white, my Toth black and white first at a convention. Toth, at that time, we can find several things by Toth these days, but at that time, back in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was really difficult almost to track a lot of his stuff down. And so you heard about this guy, at least I did. And remember, this at the time that I bought this, I was in the sequential art department at the Savannah College of Art and Design. So I was actually studying comics at one of the universities, at least at that time. I don't know how the program is these days. I know it's supposed to be more mainstream these days, but back then we were still in the early days, and this was before some of the veterans came in and took over, and it was basically just almost a free-for-all. It was very fun. And we heard over and over and over about this Toth guy. And you could find examples of his stuff in collections, but finding actual, substance was hard. And I especially wanted this more than anything. Growing up, Zorro, there were two for me. There was, well, I guess we could say three. He-Man, of course, was probably one of my first, but Batman may have been before him. Pretty much a lifelong Batman fan. But somewhere in the late 80s to early 90s, and I always say this takes me back to a place because when I first even thought about doing this video, I thought about my Aunt Mac and my Uncle T. And I would go spend weekends with them sometimes, and that's where I developed my love of Zorro, as well as my love of my Aunt Mac introduced me. She knew I was into comics and she knew I was into Batman, so she introduced me to classic horror movies. So she would have me stay up late at night and watch Creature from the Black Lagoon and the old Dracula movies, both the Universal and the Hammer stuff, and the Munsters. She was really into the Munsters and introduced me to that, and had me stay up as long as I could to watch a classic Godzilla movie marathon one time. I remember that. So really introduced me to all this cool stuff that's kind of kind of become a fixture in my life, as it were. You know, classic kaiju movies and things of that. And also, you know, she knew I was into Batman, so she introduced me to Zorro, like the old movies, and then in the early '90s, they were redoing Zorro in a TV series, which I really enjoyed. And so Zorro kind of became a thing. And so when I even thought about doing this, like I would spend, you know, hours at a time just remembering all of the cool stuff that I used to do at their house. And and I was kind of afraid that I would go on and on and on, and this would be a long video of me just, you know, talking about stuff that had no context really to this, except for uh, it takes me out of a time, takes me out of the present and into a time and place in the past. So Zorro has that effect on me, but also, um, um, this book itself. Like I said, I tried to find it for quite a while, and the closest I was able to get to it was Toth Black and White, which is one of my favorite books. And to really hone in on his art, I should have probably pulled that out. But I wanted to look at this, even though it's earlier, Toth. I want to show the bones of what his system is, because even back then he had it, you know, oh, very much so. But I'm going to kind of point some things out that will be refined the further he goes. Um, and so that, you know, like later in life, the Toth Black and White sort of anthology of his work and stuff, because there aren't that many comics within the Toth Black and White. It's mostly just sketches and things, but although there are a few shorter comics thrown in, a lot of them focus on sort of the psychedelic aspect of it, and again they almost remind me of like late Ditko, when he really, you know, if you go back and you look at those old, you know, we were looking at Spider-Man the other day, the Spider-Man annual, and I pointed out that web design. And if you kind of correspond that with a lot of his stuff in Doctor Strange, which I would have loved to have looked at, but I think my daughter has my copy of my old Ditko Doctor Strange collection. And you kind of correspond that with a lot of the psychedelic, just out there designs that he was throwing into the Doctor Strange stuff. Um, you know, a lot of it is very abstract and things. And so Toth kind of like pulled some of that in. But this is a very, very interesting and very cool book. I can't wait to break into it. We're going to look at two different parts. The part that I picked out later on is kind of fractal in nature. And I do want to say that when I first picked up this book, it was disappointing to me, because it had this legendary status in my head from everybody saying, "Oh, you've got to read this. You've got to read this." To me actually getting it and going, "What the hell? Nothing happens in this friggin' book, man." You know, my mind was so spoiled by that Kirby aspect, because I was getting into Kirby at the same time, which I had always kind of been into Kirby, but was really getting in and studying Kirby at the time. So that aspect of, you know, dun 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 dun, punch 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 punch, is very subdued compared to Toth. And there was a story that I wanted to tell. I think I heard about it on the Cartoonist Kayfabe channel, and I believe it was one of the episodes where Tom Scioli was guest starring. And he was talking about Kirby moved to California, and of course, even in this book, Toth talks about always living in California, and and how proud he was to have been able to stay there, even though like all the work was pretty much on the East Coast. And in fact, he's talking about why he actually did Zorro, even though he had no particular love for, the character or whatever, or even this style of comic, like these Western comics, because Zorro is technically a Western character. And um, so Kirby had moved out to California from the East Coast, and Toth had been living out in, the West Coast in California. And so apparently, as legend goes, nobody can really validate this, but they got together and they had a barbecue at one of their houses. And, one of them was sitting there cooking, and they got into conversation with one another. And one of them, I don't know which started it, instigated it, but, they started talking about the philosophy behind their comics. And that's the thing. Every great artist has a philosophy. And in fact, every person really has a philosophy. That was one of the things that Professor Valentine used to teach us in Philosophy 101, like right from the get-go, the very first class. He's like, look, everyone that you meet has a philosophy. He's like the baker that wakes up at, the ass crack of dawn to get up and bake bread for everybody else has to have a philosophy in order to do that. Even if it's just, bake bread, make bread, that's still a philosophy. It's so it was kind of his tract against nihilism, because as he would say, even nihilism is a philosophy. um, so so they were going through Kirby and Toth, and one of them just started going through his philosophy, and the other was just kind of listening and nodding, apparently very attentive. And then so he ended his philosophy on doing comics. And then the other one was like, okay, well, and then so for about 30 minutes to an hour, he went on about his philosophy. So by the end of it, you've got like an hour to 2 hours where they've both gone through their philosophies and have listened to the other one attentively. And then they both just kind of like, oh, okay. And they go their separate ways. And later, separately, they tell someone, I had no idea what the fuck he was talking about. So neither one of them could grok what the other one was talking about. Even though they both, I'll even go into some of the similarities, because we'll go into the flow, and we'll see how Kirby and Toad's flow is almost very similar in certain ways, as opposed to like the Ditko's flow, which in parts are very obvious, like I pointed out, with the Spider-Man Annual #1. But anyway, let's break this open. It's already about 14 minutes, and we haven't even broken this thing open. So the very first thing, I am rereading this right now, and I said when I first picked this up, it was kind of disappointing. But the more I read it and the more I studied it, the more I came to view this almost as a very important historical document. The first things I want to point out are things like this, these establishing shots. And there's an even better one right at the get-go that really pulls you in. This one on the ship. So it's Don Diego, Zorro, coming in. And I think this is actually from one of the movies. I seem to remember this scene in either one of the shows or the movies or something. But this one is almost like straight out of a black and white movie. And that's the beautiful thing about Toth. If you really want his style is almost pulling directly with the use, it's three values. It's white, it's pure black, and then there are these this duotone, gray in a lot of it. Or what's the other word for the old duotone, the illustration word? Op something. But anyway, these little dots. Op-ed, maybe? No, that's an editorial thing. It's one of the ones, it's something day, I think. Op-day. But we can just call it duotone. And you'll see a lot of that duotone. Very sparse hatching. Like when it's used, it's really used for effect, and by effect I mean texturally. It's not just thrown in randomly like a Jim Lee or a Rob Liefeld or a Todd McFarlane. It's used for a purpose. This is the texture of that vest or that shirt or whatever. So anyway, getting back to this is like straight out of a black and white movie. Very striking and solid blacks. Even though these would have been in color, they work completely without color. You know what this is. This is the bow of a ship. Those are ropes. And the mast or whatever, the big wooden pillar going up and down. That's the ocean in the back and land, seagulls, etc. The different figures are very, none of them are muddled together. Look at that railing there. How sparse it is. There's no little marks or anything. It's just a solid negative space with a couple of black blocks thrown in. And it works. And I'll show you more and more that is exactly what it is. It's this chiaroscuro style that really focuses on the negative space. And even though it's very, there's so much black here, like within this figure wearing like a sombrero or a big hat, it's almost all black, but that little bit of white lets you know exactly what that figure is, what it's doing, and its relation with all of these others. And so it's like so sparse, but at the same time, it's so precise. That's the magic of it. All right. Now, let's go over, I wanted to point that out because I am rereading this, but these are the 4 pages that I picked out to look at. And I would have gotten that back when I first got the book. So maybe that's where, I know this is from previews from Diamond Comics. So I would have gotten this from a comic shop, I'm pretty sure, because that was like a free sticker that they would have put in there. And the thing about it, and one of the early reasons I didn't like this comic, but yet became kind of the reason that I tended to like this comic. You see this page and you see the layout, and this actually has a little more action than usual. It's pretty much all talking heads. And the layout of the pages is so similar that I say I just randomly picked these pages because it's fractal in nature. It's like the same thing over and over and over again. And yet within those few, like there are just enough differences. See, there's been almost no action for several pages. Just talking heads. Talking about the action, And that was one of the things that frustrated me coming from a Kirby mindset, It's like one action sequence per comic, where you have Zorro cracking a whip and taking a gun away, and then they talk about it, pretty much. Yeah. But um, but yet the way he does it makes that like almost all you need, you know? Like that almost has more effect than 50 panels of Zorro like cracking skulls and taking names basically. All right, so going back to this. Let's let's find some common ground between Toth and Kirby to begin with. All right, so we have the automatic inherent left to right quality. Okay, but I want you to look at how, like, this shadow, which is like a cast shadow apparently from above, and even like this line and uh, these lines on these barrels are going down, and even the way the posturing of that and this gun, everything is leading you down here. And yet it's so subtle, unless I'm pointing it out, you wouldn't really notice it, you know? Um, so it's more like a Kirby than a Ditko, which is like in your face, like go to the next panel, go to the next panel, stop, okay? The posturing of this chin, as well as all of these the negative lines. So these brush strokes, the space in between the brush strokes, basically pointing a certain direction, leads you towards the next. As well as just the composition, where you have larger figure in the foreground, smaller over here in the background to the right, which pulls you, which makes the action go that way. And this just further reinforces all of that. To another one of his, big close-up headshots. So the fact that this is going down further reinforces the fact that time is flowing off of the panel, but that's further reinforced by these lines going over here, almost even more so, that are guiding you down here to the bottom panel. All right. Now, again, the flow is going that way because we're looking that way along with Zorro. It would have been very different if he was over here, looking that way. But, and also Zorro is kind of creepy, because he spends an awful lot of time just kind of spying on people. If you really go through a lot of this book, he's a bit of a stalker. But the very construction of this window is kind of like leading us into the future, So it's the idea of panel composition as time, okay? So setting up your panel composition so that you have the different elements of flow, time, pacing, and everything within it. And these are beautifully done. Another thing that I want to point out, and I'll show you this, there's a small panel coming up within the next 3 pages that really illustrates the beauty of Toth. And I'm not going to talk too much about these, but I mean, just look at this figure. There are almost, it's solid black forms and maybe a couple of lines. And that's it. It's all negative and positive, and it's just that little tiny bit of positive that lets us know who this character is. Same with this guy. So much personality, and it's almost completely solid black. And yet, we can get a grasp of who that character is. Okay? Whether it's age, the time and place, the setting that he's in, etc. Okay? All right. I mean, just look at this. The beautiful thing about the gray tone, this duotone, it has to almost be an afterthought. You have to focus first of all on making the blacks and the whites work, the negative and the positive space. Okay, the negative being the white space, because that's what you're reading within all of this. The black is simply blocking the light, you know, it's absorbing the light. So you really have to focus on that white, that negative white light coming through. And then you can go in and further refine that. Look, see, like with that duotone cut out so that we know that that saddle is on top of those blankets. Then you can further refine this with this brilliant duotone. Okay? And say, here's one thing I want to point out. Like, we've noticed these very sparse backgrounds. Like, that's just a few barrels and some ropes. But these uses of shadow make it so much more. Just one simple shadow showing, I'm guessing it's like a rafter, you know, like something up in the rafters, one of those weird, what do you call them? Where basically that braces the rafter is essentially what that's the shadow of. And yet that sets us in a place, you know. Or it could even be something on the window, like the, decorative design or the bars on a window or something on a roof. I can't 100% tell, but I mean, it's kind of odd because this seems like it should be inside because we're in the dark. And yet here we have it set up very much so where he's inside and they're outside. And yet here it looks like they're outside. So that kind of muddles it a little bit. And then that's further confused because now he's outside, you know. And it happens so fast, there's no, it's like inside, outside, outside. But it delineates action. We don't need everything to be 100% clear for us. We can still, that delineates movement, passage of time, etc. And unless we were really breaking this down, and plus this is also a kid's comic, so let's cut him a little bit of break. A kid's comic that he admittedly didn't care that much about. He didn't even really want to do, and yet he was just excited to be able to live on the West Coast and do comics. And, and so he put himself into it. But this sparse background here, like it's almost all white, and we just have black. This black arch, and sort of the outline of like what do you call that, overhang there with the Spanish tiles and everything. And even here, just a door frame and a few barrels in the background. Okay. And I was talking about the sparse use of hatching. Look, it's almost always, and even, it's texture, and we'll see that more on the next page. Look at that gun, completely in silhouette. And almost makes it have more of an effect than if it was like, Kirby style and sticking right in your face. So it's how you can get very much similar effects, very different processes. Okay? Again, silhouettes of barrels blending into this mostly silhouette of Zorro. And that was one of the things that Toth talked about. He came to love the character even though he wasn't really into Zorro at the time. And see, this is like all in shadow, these ropes hanging up there. This reminds me of like a Ditko Spider-Man page. like especially with those uh, hand lettering sound effects there, and the black and white, um, is the fact that everything was matte. So it was just black, black, with just a little bit of reflective light. There was no, like in the old black and white designs for Zorro. He said later they, gave him a little more leather and things, but you really want him almost ninja-like, where there's no reflection. It's just absorbing light, and he can slink around in the shadows, coming back to that stalker sort of thing, where he can just slink around and spy in the shadows. But that was the whole thing. That's his whole shtick is there's this military dictator in California at the time, in the area, and so he's having to basically lead this dual life of like the book nerd and then Zorro working in the shadows, this rich, very effete book nerd that everyone thinks is just a dandy. Um, and then behind that is really, the action. Okay, I'm going to skip a lot, but again, look, we've already gone over the flow, but look at just how few lines this really is. And yet it's so, I mean, that's just pure blocks of white, and then just a few lines to delineate the bottom of that kind of catwalk. Solid black. And you even get a cast shadow over here of the stairs. Um, you know, it's economy of line. You're not going all out and filling the page. You're using such, such a sparsity, and yet it works. It's like in perfect placement. Okay. And again, even the action is sparse. It's like, swinging in, boom. It's like a whole lot of setup. Actually, this has more action than usual. There's a gunshot, slinking around, guards are coming, swinging down to meet some of the guards. There's actual gunshot going by. And then, and then they're trying to find a way out over here. I mean, the damsel in distress, okay, taking an axe to that door. This is more action than you get throughout like 70% of the comics. But even it's a little more subtle. It's not, if this was like myself or Kirby, you'd almost have it like a Shining, where you're looking on the other side of the door, and then there is like a, effect. And then you see the guys behind the door on the other side slamming through with the axe, and or the axe in the extreme foreground doing like a 3D effect, which is my kind of stuff, which is why I'm rereading this and studying and being like, okay, maybe I can, maybe I can have that effect. Maybe I can reinforce that effect with some of the more subtle Tothian and Ditko style stuff. I really like the use of like the gunpowder or whatever. I mean, it's the fact that is just this black amorphous shape, solid black, and yet essentially you know what it is, and it's further refined by it's further reinforced by that match there. Tiny, again, just one line and some smoke, and you know that's a match. You know what's about to happen. That he's about to light the gunpowder. Okay, but here's the thing, and this further reinforces that. It is this face, and I almost want to see if I can zoom in. Let me zoom in. Usually I wouldn't do that, but let me zoom in on this face. I want you to look at this face of Zorro, and you'll really kind of see what I'm talking about. It's solid black. you know? It's solid black. Just look at this face. Let's not even worry about the body or anything yet. It's solid black with really two lines. Okay? So you have the solid black of the mask and the face, and then even the eyes are part of that black shape. But then you have two lines, one coming down off of that mask, indicating the nose and the lips, and then another one below that indicating the chin. And that's it. You know? And even those shapes of the little strings coming off of his mask or whatever is coming off of the black. So it's like a solid black mass that even technically we can call that line coming off of that shape. And then this, really even that almost has a Tai Chi effect where it's coming back into the black. So the whole thing is really one shape. I mean, that's just beautiful to me. Like there's so much we can learn from that instead of trying to constantly it's one solid shape with a little bit of white. And then again, that gray, that duotone is an afterthought. It didn't even have to be there and we would have still understood that. That just adds to the effect. But that effect can only happen when that stark contrast is already there. And that understanding of the white and the black. And it really adds the whole thing with, like we can see that that's just a semicircle. And yet we know that's the brim of a hat, a black semicircle. And yet everything's been set up so well already that we know that that's the brim of a hat. Okay? Hair. Part of an axe. Such simple, and again, these are really just, again, he doesn't use hatching very often, but when he does, it's like this brush hatching. It's this beautiful brush hatching that adds to the effect of just sparseness, just simple shapes. A few lines, as few as you can manage. And that is pretty much what I want to get across. This magic of just being economical in your choices. Focusing on composition. This really focuses on that like rule of thirds. That is there. That. Okay? And that sets everything up and ties everything and gives us a straight shot to see that simple match shape and that simple gunpowder shape. And that's our focal point right there. Right? So that the rule of thirds, even though this is central, everything else is setting us up where that becomes more important so that we know when to break the rules in a more beneficial manner. And that is pretty much it that we're going to look at today. I highly recommend this. It took me a while to track this book down back in the early 2000s. It was published in 1999. And it is a beautiful book. It's got a introduction by Howard Chaykin, who is one of my heroes, mainly because he was one of my supporters back in the day, which I didn't have many back then, or even sometimes today. But, during a portfolio review one time where he was reaming everybody else for whatever reason, he was nice to me and he was like, I love this, and I'll tell that story more in depth one day because it's actually pretty good. But yeah, and in it, Chaykin, who is very odd because I think of him almost coming from that Steranko and Kirby style, especially with like American flag and things like that. Um, especially heavy like Steranko influences and things. He talks about how growing up, like Kirby wasn't the man, but Toth was, you know. And so we can all learn from Toth, no matter what our style is. We can learn from all three of these. We can learn from Kirby. We can learn from Ditko. We can learn from Toth. And then there are more. I want to look at Will Eisner next time. I want to get into some of the 90s guys. I want to throw out some, again, just like this, some stuff that hasn't really been looked at that often. Um, and break it down and so that we can pull what's really working in these guys. All right. Well, with that, on to the next one. Thank you very much.